Hi, I'm Kathryn.
And I'm Theresa.
And we are the co-authors of the book, Pass the Baton, Empowering All Music Students.
Our goal is to share stories of educators who are passing the baton and empowering their music students. We want to help teachers create music lessons that transform students from passive consumers to vibrant creatives. Welcome back to the Pass the Baton podcast. We're here to talk about all things student empowerment in music education.
Yeah, we're excited to celebrate episode 50. Isn't that crazy?
Yay. That is awesome.
Yeah.
Yep. This will be our last episode for season 2.
Woohoo. So it's always good, I think, especially when summer is coming, to start thinking about the year. I can't help but think of things that's gone well this year, what are the things I've been up to. So, Theresa, what have you been up to this last school year here?
Oh, my goodness. It's been a year. Well, I'm very excited to say I have finished my first year as a PhD student, which...
That's great.
Yeah, it was a year. It was busy. It was amazing. It was really fun being kind of in this different environment of higher ed, right? Both as a student and then working with the undergrads. This summer, I think I'm going to be starting a research project, which will actually surround some of the stuff from this podcast and student empowerment, which is really exciting. So yeah, it's been a good year. What about you, Kathryn?
Yeah. Another year has gone by and and I guess I could say that like this one felt more quote unquote normal, right? We had some in-person performances. And I do remember in a month ago, I had a spring musical and it was like, I sighed a little bit like, oh my goodness, this is really nice to be together again, So yeah, it's just been nice to kind of be back into more of a normal setting, but also exciting opportunities to kind of rethink traditions. Why do we do this tradition? Yes, we're kind of, getting back into a normal routine, but we don't want to be too comfortable and not just kind of do what we do because we always do it, but is this still meeting the needs of our students? And if so, we keep doing it. If not, do we need to rethink it? Here's a great opportunity for some change.
Yeah. Oh, that's really nice to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So coming up, the podcast is going to take some time off for summer, much needed rest for everyone. So this is your opportunity to go back and listen to any episodes you might have missed. We'll be back probably August is our goal. And we will spend some time this summer recording new episodes. So, if you have, people that you would like to see featured on the podcast, please let us know. Or if you've been doing something really cool that you want to share, definitely let us know.
Please. Yes. Yeah. And then, of course, it always helps if you hit that subscribe button and let us know, so you can get all the new episodes when they start to come out. And also a rating or review of our podcast or book are always super helpful and help pass the baton.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the best ways just to keep the word out so people know about it, so they can hear this great content, be thinking about all the good things that they can do in their classroom. So definitely, a rating on the podcast, a review of the book, all of those things are super helpful. And then when thinking about summer, this is a good time. If you haven't yet read the Pass the Baton book, get your hands on a copy, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the places. And I don't know, Kathryn, we've done that several times. We've had like summer book clubs, right? And it's such a good time to to read a book with a friend. So maybe you and some music teacher friends want to do a little Pass the Baton book club. And honestly, if you do that, let us know. We'd be happy to.
Yeah,
we're happy to support you and stop by for a Zoom visit or something like that.
Yeah, and I think also it's important to remind people that your book study can be across states. Like, you and I, we don't live in the same state. We don't live 20 minutes away from each other. And yet we found ways to, talk about books through a Voxer app or through the phone or FaceTime or Zoom. I mean, there's so many ways that you can connect with people. And so you don't have to worry about it being somebody in person, although those are really nice too.
Yes, they are. So yes. All right. So be sure to subscribe, leave us a rating or review. If you haven't already, get your hands on a copy of Pass the Baton. that's your summer to-dos. but really, we thank you so much for listening and for being part of this podcast family. We absolutely love it. We love the feedback that we get, and we love the opportunity to talk to these different guests. I feel like every episode we do, Kathryn, we learn so much.
I was just going to say that. Yes, thank you, because we learn so much from all the people we get to talk to, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the rest of this episode, it's going to be a bit of a recap, kind of see what's been going on over the last few episodes. Just pulled out some good moments to kind of make us look back.
I know we've talked a lot about the projects, but what does it like the learner experience look like? Can you kind of help us see what it looks like for the students' point of view, maybe?
So I always led as a learner-centered classroom and really shifted that to like the last 15 years of my life, where I led by inquiry. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, hey, this is our agenda. Hey, y'all, what do we need to work on and why? And we would collectively create the agenda. So much so that if I was absent, they created the agenda, we created in advance, and the sub would get there and I'd get these notes like, I just sit here. I don't even know what to do. Great, do that. Or they'd write their own agendas in music composition, but the ensemble, the whole goal is student-led, driven through inquiries, an open inquiry, which they're going to answer. So I wouldn't tell them this, you're flat, you're sharp, da, 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 da. I would say, hey, are you flat or sharp? Now, okay, let's be real. A couple days before concert, I'm like, dude, you're sharp. Oh. Here's my phone, but the moment we can teach, and it was open, we would rehearse in a circle, we would rehearse I would invite anyone to come and conduct if they needed, because we had walls of sound with steel pans. It gets really hard on stage. I would invite them to walk away and fix. I never assigned a part. We raffled parts off kind of, or I'd say, okay, who's played the lead part? Who would like to be on lead? They rotated instruments all the time, which was always scary for me. But I did have a set drummer, set bass player, and guitar player, but sometimes we end up with some kids that were been practicing along and they would work with the others and they would hand off. I'm like, okay, cool. But so the triples would play double parts, and I would say how many went on double part, and we would make sure that everyone at least had first, second, third choices. It's at the moment. And you know what? Here's the deal about that. Student-centered. Here's a great example. Luigi graduated from my class in 2019. And upon graduation, he said, hey, thanks for never seeing me as a third part trumpet player. Mm-hmm. And I started crying. Right? Because he was human first. Yeah. And what a loss. He goes, that's what I was always seeing on middle school, and they never let me go with that. And he goes, here, I was the lead. I did everything. I sang. I did whatever I wanted. And I developed as a musician. Yeah. That's learner-centered. Yeah. Another example, I had this phenomenal percussionist, kit player that was playing in a cover band in middle school that was so strong that the Navy flew him out and his band out into the middle of the Pacific to give concerts. And when I found out this child was coming to my school, I sought after him and I found him and I cornered him like, dude, you got to play. I don't know, because kit drummers are never seen in traditional music programs like that, right? Unless you're in a jazz band or something. So I recruited him hard and fast, and then he became like a really key drummer. And after one of the big Rock the Hill events, and he played for a couple of big groups, his mother came to me in tears and said, thank you. I said, what? Thank you. And she said, thank you for having my son being seen as a musician. Mm-hmm. How many kids, how many students, how many different musical instruments do we lose because they're not seen as musicians, because it's not student-centered? If we would get ourselves out of the way and let the kids be a part of it, we would let every instrument in. I don't care what the instrumentation is. Yep. I don't. You know what? And if I go to a festival that's the issue, then I don't belong at that festival, because then that's something that's not about the student. How many kids do we know got changed on instruments because it didn't fit the instrumentation? That is, to me, we just wouldn't do that. I just feel like it's a loss. We lose that one creative spark that we'll never see again because we don't know what their love would have been. So it's going to be them making choices about, hey, here comes a playing assessment. What's the hardest portion of this piece that you're going to be doing for me, and why? And we'd negotiate it, because, well, I'm going to do this. I'm like, that's really kind of you, but I'm a little bit worried about that because there's 6 weeks to learn that. How about let's look at somewhere midpoint, because he was good at, I had a feeling it was going to go beyond where he could be. So let's get up to that. Okay. Or, look at, they had to play the scales, major and minor scales for me. And I didn't care when they got it done. I was going to put it in certain grades, and you could do it you can pick your scales and we'll get it done. And by the way, learner centered, you can reassess over and over and over again until you get it. Because the goal is not the grade, the goal is the learning. What does that look like? Everyone learns different pace, not by my timeline. I used to require timelines. Okay, your piece is due here in composition. I'm like, okay, throw that out. Just get it to me. And then I got to the point where everything was fluid. Just students were moving at their own pace in the classes. It's a task. I'm going to be real with you, because everyone's a different place. I know where they're going to end at the end, but I have to keep them moving. So they're not waiting for me. They just got to run. So it's pacing. It's all of those things. Assessment, where it's going to be relative to them. Any piece or performance they did, I asked them to pre-assess. I never grade the concert ever. It was, here's your pre-assessment, whatever the performance could be. What it would do is we do pre-assessments of the performance pieces all the way up. They're writing, documenting on this rubric. The next day after the concert, they document what they did and their growth, and they write examples, and that is their grade for that particular week, not necessarily for the performance, right? If a kid had something happen and they couldn't make it, so that we recreate a concert scene for them in some shape or form, and that becomes their grade. Same thing with music composition pieces. Before they turn stuff in, they are assessing it, and then they'll hand it to me with like really low rankings. I'm looking at going, do you want to fix those things before you turn it in? So you don't give yourself that score? Oh, yeah. Give me a couple days. Okay, go do that. And then come back, and lo and behold, it's better.
So really, we're getting into some work with adaptive instruments. So I guess, why don't you tell us, first of all, how did you get interested in adaptive instruments? How did you start making them? And then, where did this go as far as incorporating your students?
Yeah, I think one thing too I should start with is that I work with Abigail Blair, and we together we've made ourselves the Blair Finch project. And so I wrote those two books, a STEAM book and the music literature book with Abby. And Abby's the one that kind of got me into STEAM. I think she was trying some things in her classroom, and I was like, I need you to hold my hand. I need you to help me through a makey. What is this? And so then, but what's kind of been nice is that I think that's what's nice when you find somebody like you and I have found each other, like there's somebody who can kind of pull you along with the things that they're good at. And then I think Abby would say the same, is then once she got me through like what a makey is and some of those things, I'm pulling her through the coding stuff. So Abby was the one that kind of helped me kind of dive into STEAM a little bit more, and some of the tech that goes along with, that can go along with STEAM. But then I went to a state conference, Illinois State Conference, and somebody else we were, I guess, talking about using makeys, which if people don't know what a makey is, it's kind of like a circuit board. It looks kind of like a Nintendo play, what am I trying to say? Like the controller. Yeah. But you can hook that up to a computer with some cords, and hook it up to a simple online coding website like Scratch that a lot of kids nowadays really know well. And you can, make sounds. You're making a circuit, right? So you can make lots of things with it. And so somebody was talking about at the state conference how they use their makey and they made an adaptive recorder or an adaptive instrument. Maybe it was a recorder, I'm not sure. But that was like when my mind just kind of blew up a little bit. I was like, oh my gosh, like I spend so much time at my school trying to find an adaptive instrument for certain students in my population. And you spend so much money. And when you get the instrument, it might not even be compatible with your students. So it's just, there's so many possible missed opportunities with these expensive instruments. And this woman blew my mind. I was like, oh yeah, we could make these things too.
Yeah.
So I went home and tried, this is after Abby had helped me hook up a makey and things. But then I basically coded very simple sounds into Scratch recorder sounds, and then created the circuit and hooked everything up with my makey in my laptop. And before I knew it, I had a Play-Doh as buttons, but an adaptive recorder.
Yeah.
That a child who using a traditional recorder, that wasn't going to be a thing. So, and then it started to really open up this idea of like, oh, with just a few little things, sometimes tech related or sometimes not, I can make some adaptive instruments for the needs of my students. And not be spending all this money on these really, really expensive other options.
Cool. So like paint the picture. What does it look like with that very, very first one you made? So you said the computer, makey, Play-Doh.
Yes.
Describe it to us.
And I also met up with one of the teachers in that we have a foundations classroom.
Okay.
So so these students that have some pretty big challenges, and like, anyways, this teacher was helping me kind of refine my instrument, right? So with her help, we had the laptop, and you hook a USB or you hook a cord into the makey into the laptop.
Okay.
Then you've got your circuit board, your little makey.
Okay.
And then you've got these alligator clips that then can turn into buttons.
Okay.
So I clipped those, and then I put like different colored Play-Dohs for like B, A, and G.
Okay.
Then when I'm on the laptop, I went to scratch.mit.edu, and that's where I like made very simple coding for like a B. So when you hit space on the keyboard, you'll get a B recorder sound.
Okay.
And I recorded those in B, A, and G. And so you just gotta attach the code to the specific note on or specific letter on the makey, and then you've got your button, which is your trigger, and then there you go. So we started that, and I made it out of Play-Doh, went back and talked to the teacher of this one student I had in mind, and she's like, he hates Play-Doh. Hates the texture, so we're like, okay, that's not going to be what we're going to use. Right. But she had the idea of mason jars lids.
Okay.
So again, if you think of whatever is conductive, what will conduct energy, like it can be anything. There's so many options. It could have been aluminum foil, right? And then she had the idea of there's all these cords and the wheelchair. And like, so she said, let's put like the makey and all the alligator cords in a little small bin.
Okay.
Let's make a little hole so that the cord that can go to the computer comes out, but it kind of minimized all the mess.
Yeah.
And then, and let's use mason jars. So the mason jar lids were on top of this box. And then, there was an assistant who could hold, when you use the makey, you need to make the circuits, you need to have a full circle, right? So you got to hold the earth. Yeah. And so she would hold on to that and then maybe touch his shoulder. And then he would, right. But then, and it took, even then there was a learning curve of getting the student, the user used to what we were trying to have them do. And she had a brilliant idea of like, if there's a preferred sound that a student likes, start there. So I'm not sure we did it because we kind of got over the hump, but we were thinking about putting like a Mickey Mouse sound. Again, just like a preferred sound. So then so then the user would the child would want to use it more. So
that's neat. So the student would essentially just tap on the mason jar lids, and then each one was corresponded to a different note of the record.
Yes. And then the sound came out of just the laptop because we weren't really worried about like, it wasn't for a concert or anything. So it wasn't like we have to hear this sound super well.
Right.
But when his classmates were playing B, A, and G songs, he was too, and the kids were like, can we play his instrument?
Of course.
It was cool. Yeah.
It was. So reflection is important because it's necessary for growth and improvement, and everyone should reflect. That could be administrators within our schools and school leaders. It can be educators, teachers, staff, parents or caregivers, and even students. And so I often talk about how it's important for students to reflect too. I think about my upbringing and I think about, was I encouraged to reflect as a student? And I think back, although my memory is not all that great, and I don't recall a lot of times where I was encouraged by a teacher or a band director or a music educator to really reflect on what I was doing. I know that those conversations happened at home, but they didn't always happen within academic classrooms or learning spaces. And so when we reflect on what we're doing, we can end up doing more or having more or making more. And so sometimes that doesn't mean that we need more and many things. Maybe we are getting rid of something that's not working or not necessary. Maybe we're adding something to our plate. Maybe we're taking it away or something. But we can't move forward with renewed energy and intention until we know what is working, what's not working, and what's missing or even unnecessary in our teaching strategies or our rehearsal techniques. And reflection asks us answers. It makes us think about things like, are we providing mirrors and windows for our students to experience music and learning in more than one way? And so my doctoral thesis was entitled The Student Voice, Perception of Students' Representation of Themselves in the Curriculum. And I surveyed students throughout the nation and asked them questions about, do they see themselves in the curriculum? Have they had a person with the same gender or the same race or nationality or disability and so forth? And it was an opportunity for them to reflect on what they were seeing, hearing, or experiencing within their curriculum or their classroom, or in this case, in their secondary band curriculum. And it was eye-opening to hear what they had to say. And it was eye-opening as an educator to reflect on their answers and to realize, like, are we, am I, are you, are our colleagues providing mirrors, meaning an opportunity for our students to see, hear, or experience themselves in the curriculum or the classroom? Do I see a female on the podium? Do I see a person of color as a composer? Am I experiencing the work of a different gender and so forth? And then also asking the question, are we providing windows for our students, meaning an avenue for them to look to or into or through something different, to experience music from somewhere else or from a different composer or a different genre or so forth. So that was the bulk of my doctoral work, and I loved it. And it really gave me the opportunity to not only hear the students' voices, but then to reflect. And I often say, you know, shame on me. I didn't always do that in my teaching. And early on, I can tell you, I certainly didn't do that. And I didn't do it if I did, I didn't do it in a very structured format. But now I've been able to set up different ways that I can do that, reflecting with students, or how I want to reflect with educators and so forth. And so once we do that, we're allowing the true student voice to come through if they're willing to share with us. You know, sometimes they only share so much, but maybe it starts out small and maybe they're willing to share and reflect more as they feel comfortable in our learning spaces.
All right. So talk to us about your process. How do you get students engaged in this peer feedback process?
Sure. So I kind of came up with this process it's taken me kind of several semesters to really develop this into something that's worked effectively, especially because I teach fully online. It adds another layer of like awkwardness, you know, because we've all been in a breakout room in Zoom where like no one's talking and it's like, well, what do we do? So I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't putting my students in a situation where they were going to dread coming to class or they were, you know, not going to get very much out of it. So I've come up with a system to essentially teach my students first and practice how to give feedback before they even get into groups. Because the very first time I tried peer feedback many moons ago, I just was kind of like, okay, give them one piece of positive feedback and one piece of constructive feedback. And I realized that was not working super well. So first, so I kind of have 4 steps that I take my students through. And so we do this project in Band Lab where we write a song and using loops. And so first we build out the knowledge base. So we do a lot of song analysis. I ask students, you know, what their favorite songs are, and if I can find clean versions and it's appropriate, then we will analyze all these different songs. So we talk a lot about song structure, and we talk a lot about the elements of each part of the song, like what makes a chorus, and what makes that different than the bridge, and how do these things function in the songs that we already know. So that way they have vocabulary built up, and then we revisit that throughout the semester, but also a lot of examples of songs that already exist. Then after we have this knowledge base, I do a lot of error detection, and I call it errors only. So it's a situation where there's definitely going to be an error of some sort. And so at first I will, if we're talking about like a song form, we'll go through a song form, and maybe there are only pre-choruses but no choruses. And then I'll give students, 2 possible answer choices with the phrasing of the feedback. So we use a lot of, I noticed that, whatever it may be. So in this instance, I noticed that all of your pre-choruses don't have a chorus after them. And then we also practice the phrasing of the constructive feedback. Consider adding a chorus after each pre-chorus, or consider removing the pre-choruses and replacing them with choruses. And so there are kind of different options there. But students are practicing the phrasing that I want them to use throughout. And so we go from, okay, we have 2 options to then 4 options to then a whole list of possible errors, and they kind of pick and choose, what they're seeing and what they're hearing and justifying it. And so errors only, that particular step, really important, because then we move on to error detection, where there may or may not be errors, or there may or may not be things that they can hear that need to be fixed. And that's kind of closer to what they may be encountering in the situation with their peers, right? Because there's not necessarily always going to be something glaringly, quote unquote, wrong with their song. Because I think a lot of times when we do error detection, we are assuming that there is some sort of big error. But then we practice, okay, well, if you're not hearing anything that sounds like an error or that sounds like it needs to be fixed, what are some other things that we could say to people in those instances? And so I do a lot of sentence stem. And so talking about like, okay, when you are listening to something, maybe you tell someone, okay, we layered the intro in this way. Maybe you could, instead of, I noticed that you put the bass track or the bass loop first, maybe you could start out with a drum beat and see how that sounds. So not necessarily like this is wrong, but perhaps think about it in a different way. How would this sound? Because we talk a lot about how in songwriting, there's not really a lot of right or wrong. It's kind of just like, well, let's try different things and experiment. And so giving students kind of real life error detection, whether there's going to be an error or not, something glaringly obvious or not, really sets them up to be able to give peer feedback constructively. And then lastly, we do one more exercise that's like kind of like a mock idea of what students are actually going to do once they get into their peer feedback. And so we go through an actual example closely to what they will encounter and work through it together. They have sentence stems that they can pull from. And so they practice giving that feedback over and over again. And then I also give them feedback on their feedback. So that way we go through all of this process to then get to the point where all of my students are giving each other constructive feedback that is actually valuable and that they can actually use. It's not just like okay, I'm checking the box, my students are collaborating, but this process helps to give students the model for how to give good feedback, because it's a skill. Just like, probably when you were student teaching, the feedback that you were giving was probably not as effective as it is now, simply because at least for me, I've had so much more practice, I can better articulate how to give feedback to students. So that's kind of my overall process. And it sounds like it takes a long time, but honestly, like just spending 10 to 15 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week, just working on these feedback skills has made such a huge difference for my students.
All right, so tell us, what's the big idea?
Okay, so we wanted to come up with an acronym to help students to work their way through a practice session purposefully. And so what we came up with was idea. And the I stands for identifies. So they're going to be identifying a small chunk of their music that they need to work on. It can be anywhere from 1 to no more than 12 measures. You don't want to get too crazy. But yeah, anywhere from 1 to 12 measures of music that they want to work on.
And then the D is for decide. And so that's deciding what musical concept you're trying to improve on. It's not just this generic to get better, right? Or just to work on the notes, right? Like that's, what we hear a lot. But what specifically are you trying to improve on? Is it tone? Is it dynamics? Is it articulation? And these are some of the things that the kids might not inherently think about because they just think it's about the notes and the rhythms.
And then once you've got those 2 steps under your belt, we move on to the E, which was the trickier letter to come up with. So we stretch it a little bit because you're going to execute various strategies. The strategies are the key part here. And they're strategies that apply to your decide step, right? So, if you're going to be practicing rhythms, what strategy is going to help you get better at said rhythms? Some strategies will work for rhythm, but they're not going to work if you're trying to work on tone, for example.
And then A stands for analyze. And so we like to help the kids think a little bit through this process. It's not just, did you get it or didn't you? But what are you going to do next? So if you did not super succeed, is there another strategy you might try? Or maybe you did succeed, but how are you going to maintain that success level between now and say the concert? So that's the big idea in a nutshell as far as the acronym goes. But then along with it, we have quite a lot of materials and things to help students and to help teachers. The first of which Tracy kind of mentioned with that execute portion are these strategy guides. And we have these at a variety of levels. So we have them for more of the elementary kids, and those are going to be more general strategies. Like say chunk it, bring things into small chunks. I always say it kind of funny. I go chunk it, and they're like, go chunk it. It's kind of fun. Or my favorite is to play the spot backwards. And notice I said the spot. It's that part you identified, not the whole piece, right? And so starting with the last measure spot, starting the measure before, and then building towards that success you've already created. Starting the measure before, building towards that success you already created. So the kids tend to like that one. And then the middle school and high school kind of more level strategy guides are divided up by musical concept. So if they're working on tone, what are some, say, string techniques or band techniques? We have ones for each that, they could do to try to improve their tone.
And then once they've, done those specific techniques, because the go-to strategy for many kids that haven't been instructed otherwise is repetition, right? It's like, let me just do it over and over and over again, which, is great if it's correct already, but if you're practicing it wrong, it's going to be permanently wrong. So we want to avoid that. But once they've done the strategies for their concept, then we do the repetition piece. And I like to do that one. One of my favorite strategies is called the penny game. It's the repetition game, where they can line 5 pennies up on their music stand. Or when I teach it in class, I usually do it with 5 Jolly Ranchers on my music stand. And I'm like, all right, let's play it. And if it's correct, we get to slide one over to the other side. Great, let's do it again. And if it's correct, we're going to slide another one over. There you go. Katie with the visual. Thank you. And if you make a mistake, all of them go back to the beginning and you have to start over again. The goal being you have to do it 5 times in a row correctly. But the nice thing is when I teach it, of course, you do it with candy. And then when you're done with rehearsal, done with playing, right? Then you get to eat your candy.
And this has worked really well for my own kiddo, for sure.
Same.
Wow. There are so many things that you're saying that I'm not, you can see me sitting here and just nodding my head. Everything that you're talking about goes back to that purpose. And I feel like, Kathryn, we've said this the last several interviews that we've had. It's amazing when people are really connected to the purpose and what they're doing. And I love that you're helping teachers figure that out. Because it's one thing to say, yes, what are your values? Or what's the purpose behind what you're doing? But to really understand how to go through step by step, that's not something that comes naturally to a lot of us.
Yes. And not even that first step of figuring out your own values doesn't necessarily come naturally. It's something that the reason why I feel confident teaching other people to do this is because it's something that I have struggled to do, because I'm the kind of person who wants to be able to be everything for everyone, but you can't. You just can't. You, at some point, you have to make a decision of, okay, what am I capable of, and what do my students actually need when it comes to what style of music I'm teaching, what opportunities I'm providing, because you can't do everything. And if you try to do everything, and you try to be everything, and you try to teach everything, then you're kind of doing nothing. You're not actually showing to your students what is most important, not just to you, but to your entire community.
Yeah. So give us a look in, like, what's it like?
Into like the Composers Guild?
Sure. Yeah, we can start there. Either way.
So this Composers Guild has a very, that's a whole origin story that I kind of tell in the book. But the short version is I introduced the club in 2012, called it the Composers Guild, realized that it was dangerously close to a term that was in the Skyrim video game that was very popular at the time. So I had about 30 kids show up to my first meeting thinking we were going to play Skyrim and it was going to be a video game. And the next meeting I had 4 kids. And so it was a good lesson for me that, like, hey, if 700% of your students quit after the first workshop, don't give up. Just keep going. Or maybe, research your titles before you put posters around the school. So that's kind of a funny aside. But so what I basically wanted to do is emulate Dr. Pelusi's model that he was doing with the Wesleyan camp. And that's actually where I ended up going for undergrad. And so when I started doing the Composers Guild, I reached back out to Dr. Pelusi, and he actually ended up bringing students from Illinois Wesleyan and playing my students' composition. So it was a great full circle experience. And we just celebrated our 10th anniversary concert this last month, and Dr. Pelusi came back for that again. So that's a whole great story in and of itself. But again, this kind of the structure of the Composers Guild is we usually meet about once a week, and it's for about an hour after school. And I basically just do a workshop. So I'll take some element of composition. Maybe it's form, maybe it's melody writing, maybe it's learning basic harmonic structure. And I'll lecture for 25, 30 minutes. I'll play examples, and then I'll try to get kids either into note flight or into flat or MuseScore, whatever program they like to work with, or even some that just like to write by hand. And we try to just do those things. And at the beginning of my book, I outline a principle I call the Lego principle, where basically when kids start playing with Legos, no one reads the box. No one looks up well, what is a Lego? How does it go with another Lego? I wonder what I should. You just open the box, and kids can be 2 years old and they just dive in and start. Well, they're probably going to eat them, so you have to be careful. But they're going to start putting them together, and nobody really cares, what they do with them. And I really, with the Composers Guild, I try to battle I call it the genius fallacy, that you have to be a genius to be a composer. You have to be, writing operas when you're 12 and symphonies when you're 15. And so, we're just going to treat music like a box of Legos. And there's 12 pitches. There's a bunch of rhythm combinations. Let's just put them together. It doesn't have to be good. It's actually probably not going to be good. But who cares? I just recently saw on Instagram, someone posted, what if in art class, you only had students replicate the Mona Lisa? If all they were doing was trying to just replicate these master works, you'd get so frustrated with your contribution because it would be so far from what Da Vinci did. And so I try to just really get kids to say, don't worry about writing like Beethoven. Don't worry about writing, like all these masters. Just put notes together. The more you do it, kind of like me, when I was just learning on my first, notation program, just learn by putting things together. Take away what you don't like, leave what you like, and see where it goes. And so the amount of students who have come in with no composition experience whatsoever, and in about 3 or 4 months have put together a 2-minute composition for a trio of instruments, it really just blows your mind.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, what's it look like in your classroom? How do you take that?
So it's pervasive in a number of different ways. In the presentation, I sort of boiled it down to the 3 most obvious. So that might be sort of a good plan of attack.
Yeah.
So in the very first way that I try to incorporate it into my classroom, I noticed early in my career, and I think it's actually worse now, how quickly people would sort of snap out of it the instant I got like 2 to 3 sentences into any form of explanation. And of course, the advent of smartphones has trained our attention spans yet shorter. So I noticed that I have to get kids information as quickly as possible, and then I get them to interact with it almost immediately, which is something that especially early games, maybe better than modern games, did immediately well, right? So like you fire up The Legend of Zelda and it tells you that you're getting a sword, and it like just throws you into the world, and essentially it's like, you better buckle up, Buttercup. And then to a certain extent, failure is the great teacher in those experiences. So my kids, at least where I teach in my room, are always under the assumption that they understand everything immediately and perfectly until I give them an opportunity to see that it maybe is less intuitive or obvious than they thought. And then we do a lot with what are called like short iteration cycles. So with every idea, the principle is to keep it as small as possible and to give opportunities for failure and success, and then to make sure that students don't move on until they've gotten through whatever that item is. So we do a lot with written counting, I think, is a super easy way to do that. You could do it with note names, but starting with the very small thing and then slowly expanding out maybe into like verbal counting aloud, which is a little easier to hide, which is a great reason to hit the written thing first, then spinning it into like short idioms or moving into sight reading, just rhythms, and then finally adding additional complexity and working into the concert music in that way, which I think is very different than like, all right, kids, let's try number 14 in the book, right? Like there's so many things that can go wrong with air and with fingers and with the new rhythm and with embouchures or with bows or the way that we are holding the violin. Like everyone's going to have some obvious parallel that they can make. But I think that oftentimes when we're teaching music, we insist on far too many variables at the same time. So that'd be one way that we do it. Okay. A second way that we try to bring it, and by all means, I just talk for hours. So at any point in time, just say like, dude, shut up. Can you please clarify? Or I have a question. We also try to make sure that everything in the room is focused on the students rather than the teacher. I talk to my kids a lot now as I sort of move through the video game thing, and I get more and more obsessed with becoming a coach. It's like my new mental fixation. Yeah. But in the teacher model, it's essentially that the teacher actually solves the problems and then gives the kids a few small things to do. And then they like look at the teacher and make sure that that they've done it right. Like tuning is the most obvious place that you see the failure of that model, as you ask them to tune and then they like make a sound and they look for any cue in your face that it is or isn't wrong rather than taking ownership and trying to solve it. But the idea is I've tried to eliminate the word I or like mentioning what I would like or what I want or do this for me. So much of our language and so much of what we ask of kids is really about our agendas. And I think it's a little more obvious than we give it credit for. And I think kids pick up on very quickly when they're there as a vehicle for your greatness and your hopes and dreams. So instead, I'm banking on the idea that if I can put all of my language in terms of objectives that they may have or interests that they might be interested in meeting, that they're going to be more motivated and maybe even like bring some intrinsic to the party on some of those sorts of aspects. Yeah. And then the third big one, and this is the one that's always sort of the glitziest and has the most glamour to it because it's maybe the more different of the three. And frankly, in some ways, it may be the least salient, to be totally honest with you. We've found ways in order to try to reward student agency with like a series of different sorts of plans or blueprints or things of that nature.
Well, I know today we're going to talk a little bit, or I guess center things around the Orpheus approach and kind of your interest in that. Could you just maybe start with what is that? And
Yes. So the Orpheus approach is it's directly inspired by the New York-based professional Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. They were founded in 1972. So they're celebrating 50 years of existence at this point. But they're a conductorless orchestra. So that means that members of the ensemble make all the decisions, including planning what repertoire to play, how to rehearse, who's going to lead each rehearsal, who becomes a member of the ensemble, and more. So a lot of those traditional roles that a conductor would play amongst in the organization, it's shared by the members of the organization. So I became first aware of just the Orpheus ensemble in general in 2014 when I attended a Midwest clinic presentation. It was by Dr. Scott Jones from Ohio State University. And he was presenting on implementing Orpheus conductorless rehearsals in his groups at Ohio State. So I had never heard of Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. I know a lot of musicians, professional ones, are aware of Orpheus, though. But for me, it was my first time being presented with them. I just remember from that presentation seeing the ensemble members would stand up and give feedback to one another in a rehearsal setting. And then Dr. Jones talked about how he witnessed just independent musicianship growing like crazy and how the candor of feedback just improved over time. And so I was hooked. I was like, and this is my first year of teaching. I was at Midwest and I was like, this is it. I love this. And so from that point, I experimented with the Orpheus method pretty much right away. But it was more like once or twice per year. I found it was great for observations because like it's very Socratic seminar, and then teachers will walk or administrators walked in and like, wow, the students are interacting with each other at such a high level and that they might not be doing in some of their other classes. But it really, for many years, it was just 1 or 2 times a year that I implemented it kind of to mix things up. But then it was last semester during a master's class I was taking at Arizona State University. I came across an article that discussed the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. So it came back into my consciousness. From there, our professor, Dr. Evan Tobias, he pushed us to think about ways we could implement things we had learned it was a course on student-centered learning and project-based learning. He asked us to think about ways we could incorporate what we learned immediately or like kind of a long-term plan. So I thought, why not implement the Orpheus method for an entire concert cycle and allow that to be like in the form of an entire unit.
Thanks for joining us. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
We'd also love for you to consider sharing this podcast with a friend and leaving a positive review. That's one of the best ways to get this message to new listeners.